Okay, we'll get started because we don't have a minute to waste. We have a pretty packed agenda and lots of you are joining us today. It's great that you are able to. Thank you so much for attending. My name is Carly Kind and I'm the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. And I'm so proud to invite you and welcome you to this event today on exploring legal mechanisms for data stewardship. Just a couple of housekeeping matters, which you'll all be very familiar with by now. There is a chat and a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please submit your questions for the panelists via the Q&A function. We're recording this, but none of your videos will be on during the event, except for the panelists, of course. We have around 120 of you in the audience so far, so great to see you all here and from a really wide range of backgrounds. And we're really pleased to be able to convene that kind of audience. There's closed captioning available if you'd like, it's just at the bottom of the screen. And of course, please do follow along the conversation on Twitter at Ada Lovelace Inst is where we'll be tweeting about this event. So we are here today to answer the question, how can we give tangible effect to the ideal of data stewardship, by which we mean the trustworthy and responsible use of and management of data. So this is a really important and timely conversation. As we all know, there has been declining public trust in the use of data over recent years, and a real emerging conversation about how we can increase the trustworthy use of data for the public good. This piece of work came out of a working group that Dame Wendy Hall, who is joining us today, convened originally back in 2019, and is the result of more than 20 people's very hard work to collaboratively work together to put together a very intricate and nuanced and complex piece of work. The report, I hope you've all seen by now, it's on Ada's website. For those of you who received an advance copy, you might revisit the site and download the latest version because we made some tweaks since we shared advance copies yesterday. It's a joint publication between the AI Council and Ada, and it is endorsed by the Open Data Institute, the City of London Law School, and the Open Data Institute and the Data Trust Initiative. I just want to, before we start off, give a huge thanks to the working group for all the time and energy you put in to this, to the Royal Society who stewarded this from the start, and in particular to Jess Montgomery, who's now the director of the Data Trust Initiative, who kicked off this work and did a lot of the early work with Wendy when it first got started. I'm going to hand over now to Wendy to give us a bit more of the background to this work, why she thought it was so important to get this started, and introduce us a little to the report. Wendy.
Thank you, Carly, and I'm so excited. This report feels like it's been a long time coming, but we didn't actually start work on it till December 2019, in the heady days of when we could actually get together. And I want to say up front, I want to thank Carly and Valentina and Hannah today for the amazing amount of work they've put into this report. And of course Jess, who was our helped from the beginning. Jess was at the Royal Society then, and it came about for me because of the work I did on the in the AI review in 2017, where Jerome Pesenti and I put data trusts, as we called them, you know, in the broadest sense we meant there, at our first recommendation. We really felt the UK that AI was not going to succeed without being able to share the data, and that's what companies told us all the time. It was a real issue, sharing data company to company, government to company, and of course with how do private individuals protect their data in all this, and how do we help them do that. So and it was, you know, we had the review and the Office for AI was set up, but there was no real push to get this done, and I met with an old friend of mine, John Taysom, and Michael Hatchard, who's a lawyer, and in John Taysom's front room in Wimbledon, talking about you know, how we would get this going. And we decided we'd just get a group of people together, including lawyers. This was not just about the technology or about the sociology. We wanted to include lawyers and think about ways in which you would set up these types of data institutions. And that's how we met first in December 2019, and you're seeing the results of our work now. It's been a lot of hard work. People have spent a lot of time, and so grateful. And you're going to hear from some of the people who are involved in the authoring and the different the ways that we structured the report. And this is so important. In the timing couldn't be better, because the AI Council released its new roadmap in January of 2020, just a month ago, and one of the key recommendations was about the use of data for public good and data and infrastructure that could be trusted by the population. And one of the key recommendations, I'm just going to read it here, was lead the development of data governance options and its uses. The UK should lead in developing appropriate standards to frame and future governance of data. This is something we think is really important for the UK. And so here we are today, and this is just the beginning. We will talk about what we might do next at the end, but this report is not an end. It is a means to many ends, and a starting point really for framing this type of discussion. So,
thank you, Wendy. I'm going to just give a couple minutes on the content of the report. I'm sure you've all read it in great depth by now. I say that being aware that it's very long, and it does take a bit of time to get through, and that's by design really, because they are really complex issues that we were trying to address in their full complexity. But I hope you will have gathered from what you've read so far that the intention here is to really embrace what Wendy and Jerome in their report called data trusts in the figurative sense. That is an institution, a mechanism that could increase trust in the use of data. And we call it in this report data stewardship. So responsible, trustworthy use of data. And then to connect that to various legal mechanisms to really give effect to trustworthiness. And when we talk about data governance at the Ada Lovelace Institute, we mean something broader than just regulation. We mean the kind of layers of practice, of ethics, and of responsible behaviour that need to get layered onto a baseline of compliance with existing regulation. So we're trying to respond to this idea that there are power imbalances when it comes to using data, and that in order to increase public trust in the use of data, in particular in the public's interest, we need to build rigorous, participatory and trustworthy mechanisms, and that law can help us do that. As an aside, we also think technology can help us do that, and other mechanisms can help us build data stewardship, and those will be addressed in other places. But here we're really asking, what can law do to increase trustworthiness? So you'll have gathered from the report that we address 3 different types of legal mechanisms for data stewardship. And the first is data trusts. And in that sense, we mean the literal, not the figurative meaning of data trust. So using trust law, how could responsible and trustworthy data structures be established? Data cooperatives, and then using corporate and contractual mechanisms, again, for ensuring responsible data stewardship. We hope that the report, for those who are able to take the time to read it, will be of great benefit to individuals, researchers, organisations, and to government. We've got a table at the front of the report, or a section which tells you how to read the report in a useful way, and directs you to kind of subsections so that you can use your time efficiently. But we do hope that individuals and groups will get a sense of how they could start to define the terms of their data use from the bottom up, and also how organisations could use legal mechanisms to gain more confidence in sharing data by establishing an ecosystem of trust. And we think that these types of mechanisms will need government support in numerous different ways, and one of the parts of the report in the conclusion talks about next steps and ways to follow on and really start to pilot and support exploring how these mechanisms can be used in practice. So that's your kind of 2-minute primer on what you'll find. I hope you'll take the time to read it. I am going to pass back over to Wendy, who's going to introduce our first panelist. You're on mute, Wendy. Sorry.
We're becoming a famous double act, Carly. We've got to be careful about this. So, well, not famous yet. We're becoming a double act. We'll have to see. So, I can't believe actually when Carly was saying they had to include a way to navigate through the report, because when we started this, we thought, I mean, Sylvie was there at that first meeting. We thought we might do about 30 pages if we were lucky, because we and it's grown and grown because there is so much to say, and there are actually very few places to go where you can see all this information in one place. So I'm going to introduce you to our panel members now. Thank everyone for joining. I'll introduce them as it's their turn to speak. They've been given 5 minutes each. I'll try and be strict with them. So our first panelist this afternoon is Jack Hardinges, who's the program lead for data institutions at the Open Data Institute, which of course is one of the leading institutes in the UK and indeed the world for this type of work, and did some work with the Office for AI in this area way back at the beginning, and have been involved in this report since we started. Jack, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Wendy, and hi everyone. Really pleased to be joining today and to have contributed to the report over the last year or 18 months or so. Feels like longer in some ways and shorter in others. So I've been asked to set the scene by talking a little bit about the concept of data stewardship and why the thinking and the experimentation emerging around it, such as this report, is so important. And so at the ODI, we describe stewarding data as the foundational activity in its life cycle or value chain. So the basics of collecting, maintaining, and sharing it. And so to us, organizations that steward data make really important decisions about who has access to it, for what purposes, and to whose benefit. It really affects the types of products and services and insights it can be used to create or to glean, and also what decisions it can be used to inform further down that value chain or up that value chain, depending on how you like to visualize it. And so we argue that data needs to be stewarded responsibly, which involves finding this balance between openness and protection. And I think Ada and the report does a really great job of articulating that. It's one of my favorite parts actually of the work. Data is, of course, already stewarded. So the latest census forms are out in the post and being put through people's letterboxes as we speak. And so it's probably one of the oldest exercises of data stewardship out there, and one that's practiced by the state in this case. And so at the ODI, we've focused our work in this space on the idea of data institutions, organizations that steward data on behalf of others, as a way to encourage and support the practice of responsible data stewardship. And many organizations play this role already. So one of my tried and tested examples of UK Biobank, which acts as a gatekeeper for sensitive personal data and permits access on a case-by-case basis, and has been doing so for the past 15 years or so. And we shouldn't forget that non-personal data needs stewarding too. So organizations like Open Corporates and Open Ownership steward really important open data about the businesses, in this case, that we interact with. And so we've featured some of these existing examples in the report, as there's definitely lessons to be learned from them that could be applied to other sectors and domains, including how they've been arranged legally using licenses, contracts, and different organizational forms. So I guess in some cases, responsible data stewardship is here, and it's important that we recognize and learn from that. I think it's also fair to say that there's a real groundswell of interest and experimentation around new approaches to stewarding data responsibly. And so one of the patterns that we see are new approaches being imagined and in some cases set up to empower people to take a more active role in stewarding data about themselves or their communities. And I'm thinking here about the data co-ops, the data unions, and the bottom-up data trusts that many, I'm sure, joining on the call have come across before. And in some ways, these are more radical approaches to stewarding data, to bring it together, to tackle things like power asymmetries, or to enable data to be used to exert collective action. And it's great to see some of those feature in the report too. So we looked at a Salus Co-op, a health data cooperative based in Barcelona, for example, and I'm sure Sylvie will talk to data trusts as well very shortly. And as a final point, I think the fact that the report's been published by the AI Council with Ada and the support of lots of other organizations is a real testament to the importance of data stewardship and the recognition from policymakers and funders and other enablers of the role they have to play in bringing this about as well. And so outside of the UK, I'm thinking about developments like the European Data Governance Act and the emergence of organizations like the Aapti Institute as really demonstrating the global scale of this work. So while the paper is very much focused on a particular set of legal mechanisms and was written predominantly by the legally minded, I think it's fair to say, I see it really as an important contribution to this wider field emerging around the responsible stewardship of data, and we were really pleased to take part. So thank you. I hope that adds some context, and back to you, Wendy.
I had to turn the microphone off because we just had a Morrison's delivery. Oh, it was getting very noisy here. So thank you, Jack, very much. And I thank you for, I did mention the AI Council roadmap, but this is the first report that the AI Council has done independent of, I wouldn't say independent of the Office for AI, but obviously with the Office for AI, but it didn't go through government. And the partnership between the AI Council and Ada, this is the first one we've done of this type. And I'd like to thank Tabitha Goldstub and Sana Karagani, who helped us get this over the line from the point of view of the AI Council and the Office for AI. There were many AI Council members involved. Thinking of which, I'm thinking of Neil Lawrence and then Sylvie Delacroix and Bottom Up Data Trust. Sylvie's our next panelist. She's Professor of Law and Ethics at Birmingham Law School and a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. And passionate about one of the world's leaders, Neil and Sylvie and their colleagues in this area of the use of trust law to support personal information management. I don't know if I said that right. Sylvie, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And there are many people to thank here. And I would like to thank you, Dame Wendy, for spearheading these discussions that have led to this report. And the Ada Lovelace team for pulling it all together. And of course, Neil Lawrence and Jess Montgomery, without whom the Data Trust initiative would just be an idea, not an initiative. Now, I'm here to talk about data trusts. And data trusts provide a positive answer to what is first and foremost, and it's important to remember this, a political question. And the question is this: can we return the power that stems from aggregated data to individuals and groups? Our answer is yes. And given the vulnerabilities at stake, this power should be returned via a legal mechanism that comes with robust institutional safeguards. Now, we happen to have that in the form of trust law, and I think we'd better use it, this time to reverse, rather than shore up, what is essentially a feudal data structure. Now, the key question, of course, is how do we do that? Well, at the heart of a data trust is the data trustee. And the key point about data trustees is that they have a fiduciary obligation of undivided loyalty towards the beneficiaries of the trust. And in this case, that's the data subjects. Now, a fiduciary obligation sounds lovely, but if it doesn't come with real teeth, it can provide false assurances, and in that way do more harm than good. Well, you'll be glad to hear that since each trust is overseen by a court with significant intervention powers, a data trustee's fiduciary obligations do have teeth. Now you might ask, and I often hear this, it's okay, trust law sounds rather complicated. Are these fiduciary obligations really necessary? Well, to answer that question, I think it's useful to think of data trustees as the much needed 21st century profession. Just like progress in the medical sciences gave rise to the medical profession, today we badly need data trustees as a new 21st century profession. And just like we wouldn't ask whether doctors' fiduciary obligations are really necessary, to ask whether we really need data trustees as a fiduciary intermediary layer is to miss the point. The point is that it's a value-based choice. Yes, we can and should build other forms of data institutions, and today we are going to be hearing about contract and corporate-based structures, including data co-ops. And these structures each have a role to play. But it's important to note that those contractual or corporate structures cannot give you the level of safeguards that trust offer. So you will have to choose a structure that's appropriate for your aims, for the level of risk you envisage, and for the nature of the vulnerabilities at stake. Now, I think it's time to get concrete. If you do go for data trust, you're faced with several implementation choices, and I will only mention a couple for now. First, the governance structure of a data trust can be highly participatory or completely hands-off. Second, and that's the most important, the data need not be stored centrally. I'm saying this slowly because this is a question that comes back again and again. In fact, the data does not need to be pulled at all and might remain wherever it is, on the servers of Google, Facebook, or others. In this scenario, the job of the data trustee is to exercise the data rights on behalf of the beneficiaries and to leverage those rights to obtain better terms and conditions, or, for instance, negotiate data sharing deals. Now, here's a dream scenario for you. At least that's my dream scenario, or one of my dream scenarios. Imagine being able to go shopping on Amazon, knowing that you've logged in via your data trust portal, which has set the terms according to which your data can be collected. Imagine, goodbye pop-up windows that ask you if you consent to this or that data being collected. Well, I won't miss those windows. Now, to get there, there's a number of challenges to confront. And I'm going to wrap up with what are probably the two most significant challenges. One set of challenges relates to the fact that it's essential that there be a variety of data trusts, each embodying one way of balancing data risks and aspirations. What happens when there's a conflict of trust, where someone has put the same data rights in several parallel data trusts? While it's okay to be part of several trusts vertically, horizontally, you cannot put the same rights in several trusts at the same time. And this area of conflict between trusts will be an area that will require further work, a source of challenges, I think. The other set of challenges that has to do with uptake, and I think it's the most important one. Many people have a low level of data awareness. As a result, the average level of interest in registering with a data trust will be low. So if data trusts are not to end up as a means of increasing the bargaining power of only the least vulnerable part of the population, several measures can be considered. Of course, there's the possibility of default data trust, which would require specific oversight mechanism. But most importantly, this is where we depend on all of you who I hope are listening to this. I think these data trusts are on the verge of happening. We are soon, hopefully, going to nurture a pilot data trust as part of the data trust initiative. But this is not going to happen without significant intake and imagination from a variety of organizations, whether they be commercial, public organizations, or otherwise. So I think it's a hopeful space, but I do think it's a starting point of what I hope is a very exciting adventure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. And you say a lot about the challenges in your area of work in the data trust, but there's challenges all over this. Don't anyone in this webinar think that any of this is that easy, right? If it was, it would all be done by now. It's actually a very complicated space. It's now my pleasure to introduce Astha Kapoor, who's the co-founder and director of the Aapti Institute in India. And it says here, thinks deeply about data governance and data stewardship under the Data Economy Lab initiative. One of the two things here, one is I know that there's a lot of work in this area in India, and I'm very keen as part of this sort of work we're doing to develop some UK-India dialogue around, because there's so much interesting work going on in India, and that complements and cooperates with what we're doing. And we're really interested to hear about your work. We did throughout the report really try to bring in examples of institutes that are doing this work already, and a lot of case studies to make the report as rich as we could. So Astha, you must be in India at the moment. Where are you?
I am, yeah.
Where
I'm in Delhi at the moment.
Delhi.
Yeah.
So a bit warmer than it is here. Anyway, let's thank you for joining us at what's quite a late time for you. Do please tell us about your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's such a pleasure to be surrounded by people I've read and learned so much about data stewardship from. And also congratulations to the working group and Wendy and everybody else. Like, this is a fabulous piece of work, and it's something that we'll all be referring to for a long time. I guess I wanted to talk about data cooperatives, and I'll take off from where Sylvie left off on power. And I think that this is also a question of how we distribute or redistribute power in the context of the data economy. And I think that cooperatives as a structure have been used in multiple ways over time to get people to organize and to help them create structures that can negotiate with the powers that be. And we've seen this, and the report mentions this as well. Like, there are worker cooperatives, housing cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, and I think that this is the sort of idea also behind data cooperatives, is that, as we need to negotiate with questions of power asymmetry in the data economy, cooperatives, which are a ready structure that are available in a certain sense, seem like a good idea to sort of evolve on questions of data. And I think that, that's also, it does a few things. Basically, it has a ready community of people. And I think that's a question that a lot of us have been trying to answer, is how do we coalesce people around questions of data, because everybody's data journeys are so unique and complex. And, and Sylvie mentioned that we may have multiple data trusts. So I think, like, existing communities which have shared experiences with data, for instance, in the context of driver's seat, an example that has been mentioned also in the report, these are workers or drivers on the platform economy that have come together because they have a shared experience and also a shared focus of where this cooperative is going to be focused in terms of negotiation. It's also, I think, like, complex in a certain way because, and we've been talking to a lot of models that are trying to build cooperatives, that are already building cooperatives. The question of value and of stewardship and of enrolling into structures, whether it's like a trust or data cooperative, is still unclear. And I think a lot of the organizations that are on the ground trying to implement these new ideas are definitely having a hard time, I think, getting people on board and keeping them on board, engage with these models of stewardship, because the question of value on why will I sign up, what's in it for me, is quite complex. And as a result of that, I think, and this is also potentially problematic, which is that a lot of these models end up going down the route of, a certain kind of monetization of data, because that becomes an immediate way to communicate value, that if you join on to our data cooperative or of a certain kind, you might get financial returns because we'll be able to collate, collect, aggregate your data and sell it off, which is also a lot of what these cooperatives are doing. But then, of course, questions of accountability come into play. So as Sylvie said, like, there are tons of challenges and also some big ethical questions as we start to, address the question of whether cooperatives as a structure will work in the context of data. I think that it has some scope and potential because of the existence of a shared community and an experience that can be harnessed for a certain kind of collective bargaining, negotiation, and of course, over time, unlocking this value of data for stewardship. The report also mentions Salu Scoop, there's Me Data. These are all cooperatives that are, bringing people together, getting them to share data for medical research. So there's a huge amount of potential, but I think that big questions of value, accountability, and of course, sustainability and whether monetization of data is the right way to go is a big question. I think that what's also interesting is that, like you said, that this space has been growing, and it's also, the conversation has been growing in a lot of policy documents. And, in India, we have a new non-personal data expert committee report that has come out, which mentions, and Sylvie and I have discussed this, vaguely mentions data trustees, not at all in the way that has been imagined by the speakers on this panel, but it does think of it as a way to unlock community data rights, which I think we're all on board with. But again, there's a question of how do we really get to that point? How do we, and what are the systems of accountability, legal recourse, etc., that need to be created for data trustees to be actually an effective negotiating body? The other, of course, is the Data Governance Act of the EU, which also mentions data cooperatives, but as a mechanism for sharing and to support individuals and SMEs to negotiate terms of data processing. Now, what's interesting about all of these regulations is that they're coming at it from a public good question, which is great, and data sharing is public good. But I think that question of data rights is not adequately embedded in the imagination of a lot of these policy documents. And that's a little bit worrying, because while sharing is valuable and we should definitely, and because antitrust, competition, all of it is getting dovetailed onto the conversation on data sharing. But I think that bargaining, negotiation, and collective data rights is almost a footnote. And that's, and I think, like, personally, I'm quite worried about how quickly the regulatory conversation is moving on this in various directions. And I think, like, in my imagination, Sylvie said she has a sort of, dream. I do too, which is that, the conversation on data cooperatives or data rights should be embedded in different parts of your regulation. So I would love to see that the labor codes embed data rights in them, so that if you are an organization, and we have this in India, if you're an organization of 20 or more, you must give your workers a data cooperative. So although I think that somebody recently mentioned that this is going to be very much in some ways like the uphill battle for labor rights. And, we may be able to draw some lessons from there as well. So I'll pause there.
Astha, that was amazing. And you mentioned the report on non-personal data governance. I've appeared on several webinars in India talking about, I'm very impressed with it. And I would love, Carly, if we could organise a round table between the UK and India. I don't know if we could do it, or we'll do it with other people, because I think there's stuff in that report that's really interesting that we haven't actually begun to address in the UK yet. And of course, vice versa in terms of trust and trustees. So there's a lot to do there. You've also very neatly handed us on to our last panellist, Astha, who comes from the commercial sector. Now, Caroline Gorski has a formidable day job. So thank you for being here, as being basically the head of the data labs at Rolls-Royce, where she's responsible for developing the strategy and implementation of data innovation technologies and capabilities for Rolls-Royce, which of course is rapidly becoming a data and AI company, and has its own AI framework, ethics framework. But I first met Caroline through the introduction through Ada at a round table on I can't remember exactly, but for a previous report Ada was doing on data. And Caroline it was so timely for this report, because at the time Caroline was chair of the Emergent Alliance, which I'm assuming she's going to tell us a bit about now. So I won't steal her thunder, but I talk about this all because I think it's an amazing thing that emerged during COVID that we need to help sustain in some way. But there's so much in it about commercial uses of data and then data for public good. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dame Wendy, and thank you also to the distinguished panelists that I'm joining here. It's actually been wonderful to hear your introductions and to think a bit more broadly about the context that we're all talking about. I feel a little bit like an interloper for two reasons. One, I've really got very little grasp, Sylvie, of the complexities of some of the things that you're talking about with regards to trust law. I'm afraid my approach to lawyers is to lock them in a room with a very, very large plate of scones until they come to an acceptable conclusion, which is a tactic I've used multiple times in my commercial life. So I think the scones are appreciated, but perhaps the locking them in a room isn't. And then secondly, obviously, I'm speaking from the perspective of the big bad corporate world. So I recognise and I completely endorse, and secretly I'm a deep data left-winger, and I genuinely believe in many of the ambitions that that you've all been articulating, and it was really exciting to hear that evidence and the information coming from India, and I share your enthusiasm, Wendy. Would love to learn more. But essentially, my background for the last 25 years has really been in looking at the space of emerging technologies from multiple phases of technology and how they change business, and how that creates new markets, how that creates new opportunities, what that means for organizations who want to move into those markets, and also at a societal level, what the implications of some of those changes are. And clearly, data and the prevalence of data-based commercial models and data-based economic models is fundamental to that progress over time. The Emergent Alliance, which Wendy very kindly referred to there, is an initiative that I'm one of the co-founders of, that we launched in March of 2020, really in response to what we saw as a rapidly arriving, but as yet not yet properly explored challenge associated with COVID-19. So what we could see inside of Rolls-Royce, I'm sure you'll appreciate, as you know, one of the world's biggest aviation power generating companies, amongst other power generating markets that we serve, you know, we faced a real challenge over the last 12 months with regards to the pandemic and what that's done to global travel, and therefore what that's done to our aviation business. But because we were, if you like, at the very pointy end of the economic impacts of COVID-19 and the changes it's all brought to our lives, we could see that whilst there were lots and lots of people doing superb work thinking about how to use data and understanding the epidemiological spread of the virus, and thinking about how we could use data to unlock collaboration vaccine development, for example, what we hadn't yet seen was an understanding of how we could use data to try to shortcut, to try to reduce the scale of the recession that we are now, you know, in and are facing out of, and hopefully we'll start to see some progress out of as we move forward back towards more regular forms of life as the vaccines get rolled out. And so we could see that question, how our global economy is going to respond, what is phased lockdown going to do to our ability to transact with each other, how is money going to flow, what's going to happen to people's working patterns, how might the impacts of lower amounts of economic activity affect people's mental health, what will that do to skills, how will people reposition themselves to be able to return to economic activity as we come out of this. All of those questions back in March hadn't yet started to be explored. And so we set the Emergent Alliance up. It's a not-for-profit pro bono global collaboration of around 60 corporates, and has also more than 250 members of the public, what we call citizen data scientists, who are acting as volunteers, working on a collection of open source and indeed proprietary shared data sets that those corporations have made available, as well as we've sourced from the open source data environment. And we work collaboratively across those 55, 60 organizations. We have a board and a number of the biggest contributors from a voluntary donations perspective, whether that's technology, whether that's data science groups. I myself had, you know, an entire team of data scientists delegated into the Emergent Alliance for 9 months from April through to Christmas of just gone. That board governs the choices we make about the directions that we take, and we're very pragmatic, and we're very focused on how do we get fast answers that are robust. So they're good answers, but they're fast, and we put them into the hands of decision makers, planners in central government, in local government, in businesses, small and large, in order to help them make choices about their responses to COVID to hopefully lessen the recessionary impact that we're all seeing. Sylvie, you'll be horrified to hear we progressed for the first 6 months only under a letter of intent. But we are now operating under a full deed. So we actually use we use contract law. We have a deed which governs the formal governance of the Alliance, and our members are co-signatories to that deed.
Fabulous, Caroline, thank you. Carly, you've got a first question there, I think, for Sylvie.
I do. There's quite a few coming through for Sylvie in particular, but I will try to distribute them equally. So Sylvie, a question for you. How practical is it to assert a fiduciary obligation via a contract without building a trust organization behind it? And I think this links to the question around sustainability and incentive structures for not only individuals participating in data trust, but the trustees themselves. Could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I should say, I often get asked, it's very tempting to say, look, fiduciary responsibility is lovely, we want that, but do we need trust? And of course, you can, in principle, impose fiduciary responsibilities via contract. Nothing stops you from doing that. But the real significant question is, how do you give teeth to these fiduciary responsibilities? And if it's fiduciary responsibilities in a contract, you just have the mechanism of enforcement of a contract at your disposal. And those mechanisms are not the same as the mechanism that you have at your disposal when you have a trust, in that the burden of proof is reversed, a court can intervene in circumstances where a contract wouldn't allow it. So the first question that I would emphasize is, fiduciary responsibilities can be established by contract, yes, but how do you make sure that they really bite? Yeah, and that is an important question, because in fact, I think there's room for a paper to be written at some point to compare across the world how fiduciary responsibilities of different kinds are imposed through different legal mechanisms and the consequences. Because, for instance, I was talking to some German colleagues recently about Sparkassen. Yeah, I thought it was an exciting example of an institution that at first sight has a lot of the functional elements of a trust, in the sense that there are fiduciary responsibilities. It's a form of collective empowerment institution. But the problem is there have been scandals associated with Sparkassen recently. And in part it's because the people managing the Sparkassen, who are supposed to have fiduciary responsibilities, misused and abused those responsibilities. And unfortunately, the institutional framework is not there to prevent that. So fiduciary responsibilities are great, but you really need a strong and robust institutional framework to implement them. So that's the first point I would say. Then on incentives, this is a great and formidable question. I would say this. I think it's important to keep a really broad and open mind when it comes to incentives. I don't think there will be one answer to that question. So I can imagine many possible scenarios. One is you have these big existing corporate players, let's say a big bank, that decides to go a step ahead of the regulator and to think of its reputation as greatly enhanced if they were to sponsor a data trust that is completely separate, not just legally, but practically from the bank. And that offers as a service to its clients a way of basically having an intermediary that manages terms according to which your data can be collected, etc. That is one way. There are ways in which charities might be interested in sponsoring data trust. Data trust may also be sponsored by public services because they may be deemed to be crucial to the effective delivery of various kinds of public services. I don't think there is one answer here. I think it's a very exciting space, and I'm very curious to see how things develop. But one thing I'm quite convinced about is that there'll be a mix of private and public funding and a mix of different models.
Can I ask you two follow-up questions, Sylvie? Sorry to put you in the firing line. So one, just because you mentioned charities, there's a question in the chat from James Ball saying, do you see a role for the Charity Commission, or is its focus on public benefit misaligned with concerns around data rights? Do you see there being a tension there? And then the other question, I think it's Bertrand de la Chapelle who asked, essentially, is there a role for regulation or governance when it comes to establishing trust or fiduciary responsibility? So, to answer this question about, creating incentives for individuals to establish data trusts, is there a way to think about regulation playing a role in incentivizing the establishment of trusts?
Okay, that's a great question again. I think regulation could play a role. I'm cautious here because I don't want it to look like you need regulatory intervention for the incentives to be there. I don't think that's true. I do think that at some point there will be questions about the need for regulatory interventions, for instance, to deal with a possible race to the bottom. Yeah. So a lot of people legitimately worry about the possibility of data trust starting to exploit the monetization of data as a selling point, yeah, to become the competitive data trust. I do think that is a scenario to keep well in mind and potentially have to intervene to forbid potentially certain kinds of monetization. Yes, that is a question for regulatory intervention, top down. There was a sub question, right, about the Charity Commission. That's a good question too. And I think it's very important to highlight. I'm very careful to try and debunk the assumption that you have to choose between either public goods or charitable purposes or your own interests and capitalizing on your rights. I hope that I'm right to say that data trust precisely enable individuals, groups of people to have both. So you may want to protect, to exercise your rights, to protect yourself from vulnerabilities and participate to medical research or better use of natural resources, etc. And at the moment, we don't have structures that allow you to conjoin these data sharing aims on one hand and protection from vulnerabilities on the other hand. And data trust, I think, can do that because of the robust institutional framework. Watch and see, I hope I'm right, basically.
Carly, we've got lots of questions. Where do you want to go next? One for Jack, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You pick them out. We're picking them out nice for you.
Yeah, great. I think there were two, Jack, that I thought might be good to throw you away, but also if you spotted others you want to speak to. One was around, it's framed as an ethics question up front, which says, in terms of the balancing act mentioned between openness and protection of data, what are the kind of constituent elements of responsible data stewardship? Where is the line, or how do you come up with the line? So I thought perhaps you might want to speak to that. And there's a couple of questions which,
because it's complicated. Let him do that one first.
Okay,
it's complicated.
Sure. I've got that terrible journalist habit of asking you two questions.
Thanks, Wendy, for saving me from that second question, whatever it was.
We'll throw that to Caroline.
I mean, even that first one is, I think, a really significant one. And my initial response is to say that data is inherently contextual, so that line is going to look very different in different contexts. So to me, a medical record is a very different type of data to a weather forecast in many different ways, technically, legally, the social contracts around them, and so on. And so we're therefore going to need a diversity of approaches to data stewardship and a variety of legal structures and forms to steward that data well and responsibly, as I kind of spoke to in my opener. And so I think the challenge and opportunity of responsible data stewardship doesn't and won't warrant a one-size-fits-all response. However, we do need to be able to better decompose and assess how well data is stewarded, or how responsibly, or how openly, or how trustworthily data is stewarded. So there's a slight paradox there between it being contextual, but us needing, I think the missing piece in a lot of these conversations is an ability to decompose, to assess, and then therefore better be able to compare different approaches to data stewardship and work through where one approach may be better than another to apply in the next context. So I don't know whether that does meet that first question by setting a line. I don't think that's quite possible, but saying we need better ways of comparing and assessing, I think that's a really important part of this conversation that we haven't quite got to yet.
Absolutely. And there's a question about property rights. What do you think, Carl? Should we ask Caroline that one first, or go to, yeah? Because it actually is framed in terms of my data, but actually I think, Caroline, in terms of property rights, I can't remember if the Emergent Alliance does deal with personal data or not. Do some of your data sets have, or is it all non-personal data?
Initially, our data was non-personal, but since we have had our formal governance structure in place, that has put us in a position where we can start to work with personally identifiable data, although it is all hashed and anonymized before it's made available to our teams. So we actually...
So is it okay then? Because I think the issue for me, and this comes out in the Indian report on non-personal data as well, but it is related to personal data, is the property rights of the data that you're concerned with. And that could be data that's commercial to a company, or it could be the data to a collective, or it could be data from a personal data. So has the Emergent Alliance talked about this? It must have talked about.
So I think it's a really interesting question, and I actually really like the way Sarah, I think it's Sarah Clark who's asked it, has kind of put it in this context of really challenging us as a panel to think not to divorce the notion of data as a kind of abstracted asset from the reality of the human person to whom that data pertains, if it's clearly personally identifiable data. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. And I suppose my response is going to be framed in the context of thinking about how corporations who may collect data, whether that data is indeed personally identifiable data, or the sort of data that Rolls-Royce works with, which is not personally identifiable data. But I think the question of who owns data is a complex one, and I don't think it's enough to only talk about who owns data that is collected on people, because as soon as you start looking at data that is transactional data generated from any number of personal or non-personal devices across an interconnected Internet of Things, it doesn't matter whether or not it's personally identifiable in and of itself. As soon as you have a rich enough mesh of data, you can construct personally identifiable information from multiple disparate sources. So I think the question has to be, for corporations, what is commercial organizations' responsibility in a stewardship and corporate social responsibility perspective? What is our responsibility as holders of data, not as owners of data, because we may or may not own that data, but as holders of data? What responsibility do we have? We pay taxes. We pay taxes because we occupy resources in the regions, the geographical regions in which we exist, right? And some of us pay more of our taxes than others. The holding of data we do is also like occupying a resource in a location or in a space, in this case, in a digital space. We should consider what obligations corporations have for their social responsibility around their access to that resource, in exactly the same way that we charge them taxes for their access to resources in a physical sense.
Yes, I want to put it back to Astha here, because you might have thoughts on this very question. There are others addressed to you about, what are the rights and responsibilities who has what rights and responsibilities in a collective, and how can you share those, as well as the sort of the whole issue of property rights of data.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, you mentioned the Indian Act, and it's worthwhile to mention that, it starts off with data is a natural resource and should be treated as such. And I think that's also an extremely problematic way of thinking about data as a sovereign resource, because obviously it empowers the government to acquire it and use it in whatever way it wants. So we've actually been commenting about how exactly what Caroline said is like a complex resource. And I think there are questions of responsibilities and rights around it that need to be codified much better. And I think that question of ownership is possibly something that we should step away from, because there's never going to be a good enough answer to that. So and in terms of decision making and rights within cooperatives, I think that we've seen different models that have come up. There's one member, one vote, which seems to be a simple democracy, and it will have the challenges of democracies as we face them. So I think that that's something. A lot of them are looking at representatives. We've also tried to see how representation and participation can be balanced, and if there's a way to have representatives or for individuals sit in your cooperatives. And Richard Waite, who's on the call, and I just wrote a paper about, if can you have a personal AI is what Richard calls it, but that would represent you in the cooperative. So there are interesting ways in which your interests can be represented. I think that, again, to what Sylvie and Jack said, I think we need to figure out what the purposes are, what kind of sort of needs are coming up. And I think that the report makes this point as well, is that we need to be purpose-led. And I think if we keep that in mind, I think the models and all the decisions around that, the governance structures will come together. But I think that the purpose, whether we're looking to do collective bargaining, whether we're looking to unlock data for research, I think those are the questions that will determine the form the steward takes.
Thank you. We must wind up. So any very brief concluding remarks from Jack or Sylvie, and then
can I ask a question that might frame their concluding remarks? I'm interested in your thoughts from many of the panel. The Secretary of State for DCMS this week wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times where he talked about the need to use data for the public good and to use the moment of the UK leaving the European Union as an opportunity to reframe data governance in the UK. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what this particular moment in time means for data governance and how we might be able to use it to promote some of the legal mechanisms explored in this report. Sylvie, did you have any thoughts on that?
It's quite a long last question, Carly.
I know, I'm so irresponsible when it comes to time.
I'm excited by the idea that we might put an end to a dilemma that shouldn't exist. And it's a dilemma where we face with supposedly the necessity to choose between, on one hand, not further entrenching surveillance on one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that we all want better data-enabled tools, like for COVID or for other things. And so why should we have to choose between those two things? And I do think that the data institutions we are working on right now could help debunk these false dilemmas. And that's super exciting, right? And I do think if the UK can lead on this, you know, I'm all for it, and I will do everything that's possibly. And this relates to a quick question, actually. Maria Savona raised a super question about altruistic grounds. And I just wanted to mention the fact that it's very important to keep in mind that you can have several layers of data trust. So you can have a community-based data trust that is generalist, and you can have meta trust, for instance, a meta trust for medical research that talks to all the little trust and say, can I access your medical data, etc. Just wanted to flag this because it's a great question, and thank you.
Fabulous. Any comments from you, Jack, before we close?
Just the last quick one to say, I was nodding a lot to Caroline in that description of whilst personal data is a really important part of this picture, and new approaches, new models to steward it are of course of interest, and we're going to see lots of them by the sounds of it. I am slightly concerned that we don't consider the importance of stewarding non-personal data and open data too. That needs stewarding as well. Absolutely. So the way that maps, statistics, and other information that we might consider reference data are very important and will affect me as a citizen, a consumer, and as a human. So just a big +1 to what Caroline said, much more eloquently than I did.
I'm going to fly the flag for digital twins here, because if we're going to build digital twins, we absolutely need to be out of anything. We need to be able to do that. I think we need to wind up now, Carly.
We do. I'm afraid we are completely on time. Sorry, Wendy.
Well, I'll just do my bit and then hand.
Yeah, of course.
I just want to thank everybody. We could go, and thank you for the questions. We haven't had time. We'll capture them and see if we can answer them in future work and future reports. Thank you to the panelists. You were all brilliant. You kept to time. You answered the questions, even the challenging ones from Carly. Really, no, thank you so much. And I just want to say that, as I said, this is the beginning, not the end. It is, and I mean, this is a reference work. Really, as Astha said, we hope people will reference this, because it's meant to be, you know, this is the list of possibilities really, and some examples of how they're being used at the moment. We need to do some how-to reports as well, and we will consult with our partners and the people who endorse this report and the people about where we go next. But look out, watch for more. Carly, over to you.
Not much more to add. I'd be respectful of your time and let you all go in time, but many thanks to the panelists, and please do continue to follow us and let us know what you think on the report. You can always reach us at Ada Lovelace Inst on Twitter. So looking forward to continuing the conversation, and thanks all for being here.
Thank you.
Take care.